This stuff in Yerushalmi Eruvin, the article Ozvar edition one Daf Dalam Rav, the third line from the top. Which in the Vilnas on Nun Amud Beis, the third line from the top. Says that we say he married for a person Baal Korcho. We can compel a person to participate in Erev Chatzerus. Except if it's Doki, then he's in a Modeh Be'eruv. But if he's a Modeh Be'eruv, you can compel him to participate. So the Gemara says, how can you say this? We have a right seems to go against this. Vatani Hashochef Lo Erev, somebody who forgot and didn't make an Erev, didn't participate. Bein B'shoyeh, Bein Mezid, whether it was inadvertent or advertent. He asks the rest of the people in the Chotzer. Divrei Meir. If you don't marry Mezid Oyser, if he deliberately didn't participate in the Eruv, so then he answers, but Shoyeh Ein Oyser. If he's sure he's not, it doesn't answer. So the question is, and I'm going to learn this like Pnei Moshe. It seems that Karmeda and Chaim also in this way, the article is a different shot in this sugya. So he says that you can be married against his will. What does he mean, Mezid Oyser? Just go and override him. Say, you don't want to participate, too bad. We're participating you. So that's what it says. Mezid Oyser. By Mezid, we ask us, Mavlo Bar Korcho. We can be married against his will. What do we care if he's Mezid? Elishum Kanas. Okay, so maybe say it's a Kanas, right? Because this guy's amazing. Okay, Me'at who also Chaver Mutter, but we'll constant him. So he can't carry. But let's say let them the rest of the Chatzar carry. So it says you're right. Since they could have overridden him and they didn't override him, that's how we can find the rest of the Chatzar. According to Yerushalmi, a person about Korcho, we can compel him to participate. I don't think the Bavli Basket is the way. The Bavli Basket can't compel a person to participate against his will, just you don't need his explicit will. But according to Yerushalmi, you can seems to compel a person to participate, even about Korcho. And that's the knas here on the rest of the people in the Chutz is because they didn't do the Eir Baal Korcho. Okay, became so according to the Pnei Moshe, means some the rest of the people in the Chutzer. But here it said, since the Lashon we're using the question is Matu Chaver Mutter, the French Mutter, which really means Chaverov, but since he said in singular, we say this also in singular as well. So I asked Gemara, okay, what about the Shogeg case? Okay, if he's Mezid, he doesn't want he resists, so he can't be makle about Korcho, according to Meir. Understand? But if it's Shogeg, so Zachan Lo Shlo B'Fanav, we're going to Mazaket him Chelik in the Erev. Why not? So Meir holds Leisa does Chu. It's not as close. So what does he lose? Fascinating. It's a chovel because now if they mezakim in the Eruv, people are going to be able to come into his house, right, and carry stuff and have his house. He doesn't want people to have access to his house. He's a private person, so that's why it's not as close for him. We don't pass Meir, but we pass can be mezakim the person Eruv. But Meir, it's not as close because he doesn't want people to have that free access to his house. Yerushalmi says, who do we pass him like? Right, Bob, Rabbi Chama Barchina said, there's a case where a woman was mizake a chelik in the Erev to her mother-in-law without her intent, without her deliberate participation. So the story came from Rabbi Shmuel, and he wanted to answer it. Rabbi Chia said to him, it's not clear how Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Shmuel interacted. Rabbi Shmuel was much earlier generation than Rabbi Chia. So Tesis Ri Taka as a girsa that it's Rabbi Chia Rabbah to Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. Okay, so it's Rabbi Yossi was indeed a contemporary Rabbi Chia. Okay, so Amar Rabbi Chia, so Chia said to him, Kach shematim yavicha, this I heard from your father, from Rabbi Yossi, Kol mashad yochel laka be'ervin hakel. Anything can be lean ervin, I look at it make a ervin, so therefore we're mezakeh to a person Baal Korchoi. So not Bakorcha. That we don't know for this case. Mizaka the person a chelik in the eruv. Okay, actually, Perek Chaloin. Perek Eitzim Mishtarfim. Halacha Aleph. Let's see. In case you're starting to chum, how to make a mass chum for more than one person. Many to put down a jug. It says, "I raise a chol b'nei." So you say this is for all the people of my city. Anybody who wants to go to the base of a base of Mishnah. Anybody who accepted this condition, in other words, say had this in mind from to align this eruv from before Shabbos began. Mutter, it is permitted to align it. But after darkness, they can't be makabel. They can't align this eruv. She'em bar mishtech. You don't make an eruv after nightfall. So the Pnei Moshe qualifies this. He says, "Chol mishim makabel mi b'od yom." About you, Ktani. Somehow they notified him. She would do notified him. Even though he was only Makabel after darkness, it works. Shenis Ratza b'Za'erev Mutter. I'm not sure exactly how to parse that sentence, but the Yesh Brera, there's Brera, you can determine that after Shabbos begins. Like in Bachacham, as we had previously, that you rely to which whether it was effective or not after nightfall. I mean, load you didn't let him know until nightfall. Any but you can't use it. And because then make it after can't put down the air after darkness. Without his intent, he's not quite a shame. You have to be conscious of it because there's a chova involved. In Erev Chum because you lose from the other side. So whether you use Erev Chum or not, you can decide after Shabbos begins because of Yesh Beira, but you must be aware of the Erev Chum from before Shabbos begins. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Lo t'nisa mizakun." It doesn't say you're mizaka a chelik to the people of your city in the Erev Chum. The Lo t'nisa mizakun. What does it say? You're mizaka them in a chelik. So Shmuel Amar Tamatina Mizakin by Erev Chatzeros, it says Mizakin because you have to acquire a portion. The way the Korban explains, Tamagab Erev Chatzeros Tani Mizakin. It says Mizakin. It does say that in Perichalon. I should be the first Korban. Lotim Mizakin, Lotim Mizakin, Perichalon got Erev Chatzeros. So there it says you do a Mizakin. Why Lama Lotim Mizakin? Why does it say Mizakin? So Pliba Shmuel Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan argues why it doesn't say Mizakin over here. So Shmuel says Taman Gabe Chatzeros the Tani Mizakin where it says Zakin circle. I'm still reading the Korban. So Zakus I think Mizakin there Chatzeros Shemkini and Rishus. Oh there but base Chaver. So it goes Erev Chatzeros. You have to acquire Rishus in the house of the friend, or so therefore you have to actually be zeich and the person laying the erev has to be mizaki u'chelik. Brahman lo di mizaki in circles go says korbanei avakam beirutchum lo kani rishus acherim in circles goes. It would not be kani rishus, so you don't have to be. There's no concept of schia necessary. Just the declaration is essential. Rabbi Yochanan kuli chumrin bedavar. So he says, it's an interesting lashon. So explain, no, it's like you have to be with the you do think mizaka chelik. Talmud Shuvah says midivrein Eruch just about a pure drabanon. At Mizaki acquired Mizaka chelik. Which has a source deraisa because it's true. The deraisa is 12,000 hours. And it's 2,000 hours. It's a ikar deraisa lo koshken. It's kavachomer. You have to be Mizaka chelik in it. So it says, "I'm going to ask you the Rabbi Yochanan." So explains Korbanei the Amra Erev coming circles kosk Ita Bavli Perachlim B'Shmei Rav. Now he's on the Yerushalmi explicitly, but in the Bavli it says explicitly that you do have to Mizaka Erev Kumin. If it doesn't say explicitly on Mishnah, you have to Mizaka. Amra Rabbi Yosef Eruvin. The Korbanei says Kir Rabbi Yosef Eruvin. Amra the Tani Erev Chatzeros Tzorich Liskos Kosh Erev Kumin. That you have to. If you have to Erev Chatzeros, you do have to do Erev Kumin as well, be Mizaka. So the so this is like a separate statement. This says time of the Shmuel Asir Shmuel. The Chesed says this cause fish as skik the so called Shuyas Shabachats Achas. So even though Rabbi Yochanan says that some of the Yosef went like Rabbi Yochanan, so according to this, it's two different statements, right? I said Rav Rabbi Yochanan, Ki Rabbi Yosef Rabun, period. And then we have a separate statement going back to Shmuel to say that the reason why is in order to make all the Rishuyos as well. I have inside my Gemara here to look at the Mashbiach because he has a very sharp and original parish. He does, but it's very confusing, so I'm not going to do it. So, but I'm just going to reiterate that according to Korban Eidah, it's a bit confusing, but it goes like this: Asir Rav Rabbi Yochanan, Ki Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Bun. Period. So that's Yosef Rabbi Bun says that Erev Chetzer said the Mizak and Koshken Eruv Tchumen. And then we have a separate statement, kind of like a fragment of a statement, and it's going back to Shmuel. We say, why by Shmuel, according to Shmuel, you need to have, and perhaps this line should have been earlier, why by Shmuel you have to do Kinyan by Chetzer, not by Erev Tchumen, because by Erev Chetzer, you have to make all the shuyas like one, and that requires the being Mizaka as opposed to Erev Tchumen, which is not a Maisa Kinyan, which not being required being Mizaka. Okay, Lacha Beis, Kamashur, what's the shir of Erev Tchumen? So, Mazur Shteisus Kol Achol Bechor. Amount of food for 2 meals for each and every person who's a participant in Erev Tchumen. This goes by the amount of food a person eating 2 meals on a weekday and not on Shabbos. Divrei Meir. Shabbos amount of food a person eat on Shabbos and not on a weekday. According to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Shabbos Elu ve'elu miskam lahaka. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda have in mind to be late, meaning according to Rabbi Meir, one eats more on Shabbos, so therefore you go by 2 meals on a weekday. Says one eats more on a weekday, and therefore you go by 2 meals on Shabbos. And I was going to explain. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Meir, Rabbi Yochanan says in different shir, he says, "Mikikar b'punyon me'arbasim misela." When they're so a nice pair, a nice picture in the parish. When you have a kikar of the value of punyon when they're forced in a seller. So here's a seller, that's the money. Requires forced in, that's the grain. And it explains there are 4 dinar in a seller. So that corresponds to the forced in. Each dinar has 6 mos, so which means that there are 24 mos in a dinar. And and therefore, if we looked at loaves of a kav, the 24 6 kabin in a 6 kabin in a saw, right? 6 kabin in a saw. So therefore, there would be actually 1 loaf each per ma, right? Because corresponds 24 ma in corresponds to 24 kabin. There are 2 pidyonos in each ma. So in 24 maos, there are 48 pidyonin. So that's of the 24 loaves, 2 pidyon per loaf. A kikar, which is purchased per a pidyon, for a pundion, is actually a chatzikav, right? So your loaf would be a loaf the size of a chatzikav, which is, it shows a whole loaf here, but because it's half of that loaf of a kav would be the amount of the shear of whatever you purchase for a pundion. Okay, that's the first opinion. Okay, so there again, 48 pidyonis in the selah. There are 24 kav in the selah. Is that right? 48 pidyonis in the selah, 24 kav in the selah. So therefore, a kikar for purchase for a pundion is half a kav. Okay. Now the other opinion here is let's read this again. Kikar bepundion. The kikar you can purchase for pundion when they're forced in for sale. So Rabbi Shimon says no, different shear. He says 2/3 of a kikar when there are 3 kikaros in a kav. So that's 2/3 of a third, which is 2/9. So when he instead of half a kav, which Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says. Rabbi Shimon says 2/9 of a kav, which is substantially less, since that's much less than half a kav. Okay, that's their machlokas. Chetzia beis hamnuga. Now we take half of the loaf according to each of these two tanoim, and that's the amount of food which you to eat, which determines how long you have to be in a house which has tzaras in order to become tamei, in order to require that kibbutz begadim. You'll be show a kedei seuda, and the question is, what's kedei seuda? You have to stay in Mount. You don't have to actually eat the meal, but you have to stay in the house long enough to eat a meal. And the meal which you have to is determined by a half of the loaf of what each of these people, these Tanoim, was discussing. And it's a little bit of a trick here, because according to Rabbi Shimon, he said 2/3 of a loaf. So you have to go back to the loaf itself. So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, it's kind of straightforward. You have a loaf of half a kav. Half of that loaf, which means a quarter of a kav, is what's going to the amount of time if you would eat that pass that loaf in a bais muga, or stay that long in a bais muga enough to eat that amount, then you become a tame, and your begadim are also require kibbutz begadim. So come time even you just go in. Kibbutz begadim is not even spend enough time there in order to eat that loaf. So according to him, again, it's half of this kikor is talking about, so therefore it's a quarter of a kav. According to Rabbi Shimon, however, already talking about 2/3. The 2/9 was 2/3 of the loaf, but the loaf itself was a full third, right? It was remember, the loaf was a third of a kav, and for Erev Tchurim required 2/3 of that loaf. Go back to the full loaf, a third, right? And take a half of that, and that's what is the amount of time that you tarry in the Bais Hamnuga, you require kibbutz begadim. So it's a half of a third, which means a sixth, right? So according to the Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, the shear for Bais Hamnuga is a quarter of a kav. That's when the amount of time to consume that loaf and make quiet kibbutz begadim. According to Rabbi Shimon, it is a sixth of a kav, which is half of his loaf, but he took 2/3. But if for this, he takes half of it to be determined the shear in Bais Hamnuga. This, by the way, as I'm forced to point out, is the pras. When you talk about Kedechilas pras in the entire Shas, that's talking about a pras, a prusa of a loaf, and it is the loaf of half of the loaf, where there's a third of a kav in each loaf. So a sixth of a kav is Kedei Achilas pras. Now the carbon Ada here gives a measure, but the measure is not the correct measure according to the Yerushalmi. He goes with the Bavli and brings it in here and kind of throws. So ignore the carbon Ada on this. So half of this half is is Kedei Livsos Agvia. Meaning, if you eat ochlim tmeim the size of half a pras, then you can no longer eat truma. It's the rabbanon, because with the raisa, food is not matame adam. Rabbanon, they made a decree that somebody who eats is possible truma until he goes to the mikvah, and the shear they gave was a shear of a chatzi pras, and the chatzi pras, of course, according to depending on who you hold, like Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, or like Rabbi Shimon, it could be different shear. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka actually is the shear is half of the quarter, which means sorry, half of that half of the half, which means an eighth of a kav, and according to Rabbi Shimon, it's half a sixth. It means a 12th of a kav. Okay, that's the shear for being matame yourself. You shouldn't be able to eat truma. Okay, so Mar brings it back to the beginning of the Mishnah. On a weekday where you don't have what to eat, he eats less bread. So Shabbos the Islay Malocha on Shabbos he has more to eat. In other words, more delicacies besides the bread. So to eat that more delicacies, ochel pisa sagin. He eats more bread. So therefore, according to Rabbi Meir, as we said in the Mishnah, mezon l'chol Shabbos, we take the amount of bread he would eat on a weekday, which is less than the amount of bread he would eat on Shabbos. We turn bozen shtei sudos. I don't read the opposite. It says b'chol leiste malochal. On a weekday, when he has less delicacies, ochel pisa sagin. He's going to eat more bread. But shufta isle malochal on Shabbos, he has more delicacies. Ochel pisa tzivchar, he eats more of the delicacies and less of the bread. So therefore, we go by the amount of bread we eat on Shabbos, not the amount of bread which he eats on a weekday. The Tani Kane, we learned in a brisa, Kroven Divrayim Leos Shovin. Now, Kroven Divrayim, to be equal, sounds like going back to Rabbi Meir and Rabbanim, but it's and Rabbi Yehuda, but it's not. It's going on Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan and Broka. That they're similar in size, which doesn't seem the case when we learned in the Mishnah. So the Yerushalmi has to clarify this issue. So Yerushalmi asks, Isachamei, come see, is that true? Ahain, the Rabbi Yochanan Broika, Avad Igula Treas Arbain. He makes his loaf of Chatzi Kav, which is 12 beitzim. Right, that's the size of his loaf. Ahain Avad Igula, and the Rabbi Shimon makes his loaf from tamne. He makes his loaf from a third of a kav. He said of that third, you only need two-thirds of that third in order to make the eruv. So that's but the loaf itself is tamne. So the loaf itself already beginning with the loaf itself is only 8 eggs. Right, because a third of a kav is 8 eggs. If they're going to say they're similar, they're not similar at all. So it's very, very, in the final analysis, according to Rabbi Yochanan Broka, you're going to have 12 beitzim as your share for two meals. Right, that's your chatzi kav. And according to Rabbi Shimon, you're going to be 5 1/3 beitzim, which is 2/3 of the 8 beitzim. So that's a substantial difference for your. How can you say their share croving to be similar? So Gemara is going to give an answer, but that already is part of tomorrow. So we'll see you tomorrow.